Yeah, thank you. Great to be back here. I used to work here. Was it 16 years ago? I was saying earlier, last time I was here 16 years ago. And I now live in Eastbourne with my wife and daughter. And if you're starting to pick up a bit of an accent, you'd be wrong. You've got the accent. I speak perfectly normally. I've lived in the UK about half my life, grew up in Australia, so I've got the worst of all worlds. I sound like a POM to the Australians. I sound like a convict to the English, but that's my burden. So we're gonna think about some deep stuff, some sensitive stuff. We're gonna think about the issue of mental health, and I just want to begin with some statistics, really, that opened my eyes as I was thinking about introducing this topic. Did you know, for instance, that 1 in 4 people in the UK will experience a mental health problem in any given year, and that three quarters of those sufferers receive no treatment for that mental health problem? Did you know that the cost of mental health problems in the UK is estimated at somewhere between 70 and 100 billion pounds, which is 4.5% of GDP? And did you know that 70 million days are lost from work each year through mental health issues? It is the leading cause of sickness absence. That's not just true in the UK, it's also true globally. Globally, mental health problems constitute the largest single source of world economic burden. That's 1.6 trillion pounds per year, more than the economic burden of cardiovascular disease or chronic respiratory disease or cancer or diabetes on their own. It's a big issue. But mental health issues are not just big nationally and globally. Personally, for me, it is a great issue. Very interesting. In 2007, a bishop laid hands on my head and actually charged me in the old Anglican liturgy with the cure of souls. Andrew, too, was charged with the cure of souls. That's what an Anglican minister is given. And maybe you know that in Greek, the word soul is the word psyche. So literally a minister of the gospel is a doctor of souls, or you could translate that as psychiatrist. Obviously, haven't had medical training in these sorts of things, but anyone working in a caring profession knows that you are dealing with people who are going through the mill, and if you don't have a love and a burden for people who are in the darkness, then you need to get out of those caring professions. Closer to home still, I'm married to Emma, and Emma has struggled with an eating disorder very seriously, first as a teenager and then again as an adult during our married life. So I thought we could just look at Emma's story just for the next few minutes about her struggle in the darkness.
Glen Scrivener, and twice in my life I've had anorexia, which nearly killed me. But on both occasions, as a child and as an adult, I would have said that I was a Christian. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that when I was about 13 and became a Christian, that's when some of my problems actually started. Now, it's funny because you hear about people with their testimonies sometimes, and you think, well, that's when it all goes right. Your skin improves and you get a boyfriend and all the rest, but not for me. And I think it's got a large part to do with the kind of God that I found, the God who actually isn't the real God. It wasn't Jesus, but a God that I kind of made in my own image. And this God was a God who was all about rules. He was all about performance. And I figured that he kind of got me saved, but then from then on in, the rest was up to me. And in some ways, that you might think that's bad news, but I'm one of life's good girls, so it sounded to me like that was actually good news instead. I like rules. In our family, I have a younger brother and sister, and we've got a saying, which is that my sister got the brains, my brother got the looks, and I got the morals. So I came off pretty bad on that one. The problem was that no matter how good I tried to be, whether, in looks or in grades or in morals or whatever, it turned out that good was never good enough. So what happens when a good girl goes off the rails? Well, I turned to drugs, but not drugs as you'd hear it in a conventional sense. My drug was being thin. My drug was anorexia. And for me, it wasn't about being size 0. I didn't look in the mirror and think I was fat. I didn't want to be like Kate Moss or anything like that. For me, fat was all about mess. I felt like there was too much of me. I was too intense. I didn't look the way I was meant to look. I didn't know how to say things the right way. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know where I belonged. Whatever I did, I felt it just wasn't enough. And so being thin was a way for me of cleaning up the mess. I felt like I was red wine spilt on a white carpet. And whenever I tried and got thinner, it was like I was stainless steel. It was like I was cleaning myself up. The old me wasn't working, so I decided I'd make a new one. But the problem was that even though I thought I was in control of my eating disorder, it was controlling me. As a child, I got help. I got very sick, but we got counselling and I put weight back on again. But on the inside, the issues were all still there. So what does a good girl do? Well, I threw myself into Christian ministry. And 7 years ago, if you'd seen me, you'd have seen someone who was married to a vicar, studying at Bible college, thriving children's ministry. We were dynamos and we were going to really go far. But on the inside, I was scared, and the old patterns were starting up again. I was scared of being a vicar's wife. I don't know how to do a tray bake. I'm not a very welcoming and open person. I was scared of it all. I didn't know how to handle it. So the old patterns started again. And it wasn't glamorous. I got really, really sick. There wasn't my parents to feed me spaghetti this time round. So my hair fell out and my organs started shutting down. My nails turned black. I remember trying to get up to go to the loo one day and I didn't make it. Just lay there and pooed myself on the floor. And that's sort of the face of an eating disorder. It's not glamorous. It's really, really horrible. It's a bad place to be. We were waiting for me to die. It seemed like no one could help, but somebody else died first. That was my grandmother. I was very, very close to her, and she was in Ireland. I was over in England, but I was too sick to make it to the funeral. And that night, I looked into the fire, and I cried out to God. And Lord, I said, look, I've been running from you. I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm doing. But if you'll take what's left, will you have it? And the God that I met there was no thunderbolt or lightning or anything like that. I opened up my Bible, and I met Jesus. Not the God I thought I knew, but the God who knew me. And funnily enough, I read about him in the book of Revelation. There were 2 pictures of him I saw there. One was a lion, blazing, in control, eyes like fire, unstoppable, more intense than I could ever be. But the other picture was a lamb, someone who died for me, someone who was broken and who understood what it was to be weak. And it was those 2 things, his power and his majesty and his control, but also his weakness. And it was his kindness that finally brought me to my knees. You see, I was wrong about God. I thought he was about rules. I thought he was about masks, but he didn't want my masks. He didn't want my apologies. He didn't want me to do better. He didn't want my performance. Jesus wanted me. And I knew that I was broken. I've known that all my life. I didn't know that I was loved. I didn't know that I was utterly accepted. And when I knew this, it changed everything. That began for me the process of a long recovery. And it takes years. It is a process. It's hard. You go backwards, you go forwards. It's not simple. But this is where I started. You see, I spent my life trying to find the God that I could never please. But in the darker place, it actually turned out that Jesus had found me.
So as we think about mental health struggles, I'm sure you can think about the people in your life, people who struggle. Perhaps you come carrying a burden this evening yourself. I want to let you know that you're in a safe place. You certainly don't have to share anything at all. You can come, you can listen. There'll be various opportunities this evening. We're going to break up and talk in groups more generally about how we help those who are suffering. So you certainly don't have to volunteer any information about yourself. But as we set expectations, we're going to be talking about life in the darkness. I'm not coming from a medical professional perspective. I'm coming from the perspective of someone who wants to help. Someone who sees people who get in the dark and wants to know, how do you climb down into that pit and offer help? Because at times all of us need that help. At times, all of us fall into that pit and are in the position of needing that kind of care. Tonight, we're not obviously going to cover the whole gamut of mental health problems at all. I thought we could focus in on depression as a kind of a case study for life in the darkness. And I thought actually Stephen Fry would be someone good to turn to hear about his experience of depression. And as we watch this next video, I'd love you to be thinking, because we'll break up into groups in a second, I'd love you to be thinking, what are the images and descriptions that Stephen Fry uses to describe depression, and whether those resonate with you? And also, what are some of the suggested solutions or helps that he offers to us? So let's be thinking about how he diagnoses the problem with depression and what kind of solutions he offers for it. Let's watch the video.
There comes a time when the blankness of future is so extreme, it is such a black wall of nothingness, not even of bad things. It's not like there's a cave full of monsters that you're afraid of entering the future. It is just nothingness. Le néant, as the French would say, la vide, the void, the emptiness. And it is just horrible.
The actor, writer and presenter Stephen Fry can also see the beginnings of his bipolar disorder in his teenage years.
It came as quite a shock to me to realise that the feelings of suicidal thoughts that I had were actually rare, and that these were not the norm. Many other feelings I had were perfectly normal, but the feeling of wishing my life would end and trying to do something about it, which I did from, I guess, 17, 18 a few times, that I discovered was not usual. And I suppose that is as good a time to date it from as any other.
In the late 1990s, Stephen Fry was appearing in a West End play when he went into a terrible depression. One night he sat in his car in the garage on the verge of suicide. In despair and confusion, he left instead on a ferry for France.
I saw these rows of, newspaper headlines and fears for Fry type thing. And I stared at it in complete disbelief. I mean, it was absolutely staggered. I can't believe I made people worry so much.
After realising he'd inadvertently prompted an international search for his whereabouts, he returned to London and admitted himself to hospital. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder.
It's horrible to contemplate a futureless future, if that isn't too impossible. And so you just want to step out of it, to step out of the whole race, the whole business. The monstrosity of being alive overwhelms you.
In 2006, Stephen Fry was filming a documentary about his mental health struggles when he fell into a bleak depression.
For the last few days, I've been feeling increasingly depressed.
Very sort of black stage at the moment, and would love to be somewhere else other than here, frankly. I'm fully aware I'm a very awful person to be with. I find it difficult to meet people's eyes. I find it very difficult to connect to people. I find it very... I just want to be alone, frankly. I'm just praying that it'll pass, basically, because it's irritating, and I hate myself for it. I mean, I've never thought that I hear voices, but I do have a voice telling me I'm a complete all the time in my head.
Usually when I feel like this, I hide away. I can't this time. For me, that numbing kind of depression comes 3 to 4 times a year and lasts a week to 10 days. I spend the time in the house, staring at the ceiling.
Severe mood swings are still a central feature of Stephen Fry's life.
Mood to me is like weather. If it's raining, it's no good saying it isn't raining. It is real, That water is actually falling from the sky. It can take you by surprise because it can happen in a sort of crossover, a transitional phase of moods when you're actually quite up. And you can't really make sense of it because it's as if the clouds are coming in, but you feel good. So you think, what's this really weird? Well, what's that about? And then, and it might be 2 days later that it's just got heavier and heavier. The best talking therapy is really listening therapy. It's not talking therapy at all. There's a room in which allows you to talk to yourself, and most of the talking is done by the client or patient or whatever. And then just occasionally, it's the usual thing of, you're sort of saying, I know I shouldn't do it. And they go, why do you say shouldn't? And then you say, well, yeah, no, you're right. Oh, well, yes, and it's bits of that. The thing that keeps one living is a sense of future, that there will be a tomorrow, and tomorrow I've got to do this, and then the day after I've got to do that. Not that any of these things have a particular logical purpose or a convincing reason to exist, but they somehow keep one going. In the words of Dorothy Parker, a great wit and writer and poet, you might as well live, was her poem that she wrote.
Do you want to break up into maybe 3s and 4s or whatever seems convenient as you shift around in your seats? And just if you could talk about these two questions. What descriptions of depression stood out to you? So really as he talked about the problem. And then what do you think of Fry's suggested solutions? Should we get into groups and just spend 4 or 5 minutes thinking about those things? And then we'll come back together. So let me break in on your discussions. Some very evocative phrases that Fry used. A futureless future, that's a pretty bleak prospect. And then this concept of the weather, the storm that blows in, that you can do nothing about. I found that a very interesting image that Fry returns to many, many times as he speaks about his own mental health struggles. And I think some of his suggested solutions are very, very helpful. In fact, for the rest of the time of my talk, I'm just going to kind of unpack 3 things that I think Stephen Fry said, which I think are absolutely true about how we address mental health struggles. And I want to suggest that from within a Christian framework, those 3 things actually make a heck of a lot of sense. The first thing is the fact of your feelings. So that idea of depression being like the weather. You cannot do anything about the weather. The weather just closes in, and you can shake your fist at the clouds, but it does you no good. You just get wet. And just making your peace with the fact of your feelings is very, very important. And yet, as we'll see, if you're looking to care for somebody, it's so common for people to try to massage away the fact of the depression and to say, snap out of it, it's not that bad, it's only feelings, it's all in your head. So I think that first acknowledgement that there is a fact to deal with, there is a depression that you need to wrestle with and not just wish away. I think that's absolutely vital if we're going to deal with this issue. The second thing he pointed to, he spoke of it in a more professional setting in terms of a talking therapy or a listening therapy, words that are said, being in a space in which you are able to share your heart. And it is just very interesting. If you let someone talk for long enough, they will share their heart. So often we don't feel heard and we don't feel listened to because we cram everything we have to say into 140 characters and get it out there. And yet, if you give someone 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours to share their heart, it is astonishing. You might not need a PhD in psychiatry in order to diagnose various problems if we allow one another to share themselves with words. And I think the power of friendship, the power of someone coming alongside and sharing life and sharing those words is incredibly powerful. And then the third thing is a future, that sense of future. Absolutely vital. And I guess I want to finish our time in a second by thinking, can Stephen Fry give us a sense of future? Or are there resources within the Christian faith for giving us not only an acknowledgement of the fact of the despair, of the darkness of the valley, not only true friendship in the midst of despair, but also a future that can make sense of this valley as a temporary thing, a shadow that will pass, and we have good reason for thinking it will pass. So let's just think about those 3 things. And first of all, the fact of the feelings. The Bible is very, very upfront with the fact of the dark night of the soul, the fact of the valley of the shadow of death. And you might know that in the middle of the Bible, there is a book called the Book of Psalms, which is literally 150 worship songs that were sung by the Israelites, written from about 1000 BC forwards. But of those 150 songs, the word psalms means praises, and yet the number one genre of psalms is a psalm of lament, a psalm of despair, a psalm where you say, by the rivers of Babylon we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion, as Boney M sang, but it began life as a psalm. And this book of songs, this book of praises, is a book that is incredibly realistic about the dark night of the soul. And I thought I'd just highlight one of the Psalms, Psalm 88. It is perhaps the bleakest of them all. And in Psalm 88, we get these three images of the dark night of the soul. The first image is this image of being buried alive. Does that resonate, this feeling of just life getting on top of you so much, the claustrophobia of your troubles that close in? Here is how Psalm 88 verse 3 puts it. I am overwhelmed with troubles, and my life draws near to death. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like one without strength. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. He's addressing all this to God. This is a bold prayer, don't you think? Whom you remember no more, God, who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. So here's this image of being buried alive, and it is extraordinary. You go through the religious texts of the world, and you will find sometimes prayers that are this bleak, that are this accusatory, shaking their fist at God, but usually those prayers are put on the lips of the enemies of God. Here within the Bible, you've got believers who are able to get very, very real with God and are able to shake their fist. In the Bible, despair can be praise. Even despair can be praise, as it is prayed, as it is articulated. So here's this first image of being buried alive. The second image in the psalm is this image of drowning. Sometimes the psalmist talks about the waters have come up to my neck, and it's this idea of, do you get that sense of life just filling up and filling up and filling up, and you get on your tiptoes, but it's not enough, and then it goes over your head. And this is how the psalmist puts it. All day long your terrors surround me like a flood. They have completely engulfed me. That resonates with me. I don't know if it resonates with you. These images of being buried alive, drowning. Or how about this image, an image of being abandoned? It can be a very lonely place, depression, a very lonely place. And here the psalmist, we're not sure of the circumstances in which this happens, and yet the psalmist prays, you, God, you have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend. That's actually the last line of the prayer. What a prayer, hey? Darkness is my closest friend. Amen. Could this really be in the Bible? Actually, there are about 50 of such prayers in the Bible by people who are engaging with this dark night of the soul. Depression is not merely a modern concern. Here is a prayer 3,000 years old that is dealing with exactly these kinds of realities, being buried alive, being drowned, feeling abandoned. And then I think in the history of the church, the person who has explained the Psalms better than anyone else was an old preacher in the 19th century called Charles Spurgeon. And he wrote a book called The Treasury of David that unpacks the Psalms with a real depth, a real profundity. And it's no coincidence that he's a man who struggled with depression all throughout his life, very, very seriously. And he was able to engage with these songs of lament. And I just want you to listen to some of the things that he says about this particular psalm. And just remember that he's writing in the mid-19th century before Freud, before psychotherapy, modern psychotherapy. He says this, The one writing this psalm felt as if he were as utterly forgotten as those whose carcasses are left to rot on the battlefield, as when a soldier mortally wounded bleeds unheeded amid the heaps of slain and remains to his last expiring groan unpitied and unsuccoured. So did this psalmist sigh. He sighed out his soul in loneliest sorrow, feeling as if even God himself had forgotten him. How low the spirits of good and brave men will sometimes sink. Under the influence of certain disorders, everything will wear a somber aspect, and the heart will dive into the profoundest deeps of misery. I love this bit. He says, "It is all very well for those who are in robust health and full of spirits to blame those whose lives are sicklied over with the pale cast of melancholy. But the evil is as real as a gaping wound, and all the more hard to bear because it lies so much in the region of the soul that to the inexperienced it appears to be a mere matter of fancy and diseased imagination." Then he writes this sentence, "Reader, never ridicule the depressed. Their pain is real. Though much of the evil lies in the imagination, it is not imaginary." So again, here's this man writing 150 years ago, before the birth of modern psychotherapy, and just acknowledging the fact of our feelings. It is like rain and you can't shake your fist at it. It is real. Depression is real. And in fact, he goes on to say that the mind can descend far lower than the body. For the mind there are bottomless pits. The flesh can bear only a certain number of wounds and no more. But the soul can bleed in 10,000 ways and die over and over again each hour. Isn't that interesting? If you have a physical wound, so often if you're depressed, you feel like, well, I have no right to feel so low. It's not as though I've got a gangrenous leg. It's not as though I've got cancer. There's nothing physically wrong with me. And Spurgeon is saying, you know what? Actually, if you had a physical malady, there's only so much badness that you could actually cope with. If you bleed, you're going to bleed out, and then it's over. But the soul can bleed to death 1,000 times a day. Really putting words to the fact of our feelings. But then secondly, Stephen Fry thought about another help in the midst of our struggles, not just the fact of our feelings, but friendship. Being in relationships where we can share our struggles. The oldest book in the Bible, the book that was written down earliest, is the book of Job. It's this epic poem that really engages with this issue of suffering. And you might know that Job, at a single stroke, he loses his family, his wealth, his health. And if that's not bad enough, people come along to try to fix him. There are those who try to care for him and bring comfort and consolation, but they turn out to be miserable comforters. Perhaps you've heard the saying, miserable comforters or Job's comforters. He has these 3 friends who come and try to give him helpful advice and try to fix him. But by the end, he calls them absolute tormentors. I'll give you a flavor of some of the things that these miserable comforters say. One of them says in chapter 4, verse 7, "Job, consider now who being innocent has ever perished. Where were the upright ever destroyed?" What's his life philosophy? His life philosophy is good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. Bad things are happening to you, Job. What does that mean? You've done wrong, clearly. And actually, it's because of their understanding of the way the world works. They want to help, but because of their misunderstanding of the world, all their help ends up tormenting Job. Because they cannot cope with the thought of righteous suffering, innocent suffering. And they must look for solutions, because Job must be doing something wrong in his depression. Do you ever find that? So often with our friends, they have a problem and we want to help them, and we're really compassionate for the first day or 2 or 3, or it might stretch to a week. But if they're still not sorted out, we start to clip out, articles from the newspaper, and we go online and we find out that, goji berries are a superfood, and if you would just try this diet, and if you just go to this person or try a bit of exercise, we want to fix them and fix them and fix them. And in the end, we start blaming them for their own problems. And all of a sudden, we've become a Job's comforter, a miserable comforter. Here's what one of the other comforters say. Chapter 8. Bildad the Shuhite. He replied, "How long will you say such things, Job? Your words are a blustering wind. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin." Man, with friends like these, who needs friends, right? "But if you will seek God earnestly and plead with the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, even now he will rouse himself on your behalf and restore you to your prosperous state. Your beginnings will seem humble, so prosperous will your future be." And again, it's this understanding that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. If you are going through a prolonged period of badness, you must be bad, Job. And if you have that view of the world, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, all your comfort will turn to torment. It will. But it is such a temptation for us. In the interest of time, I'll skip over the next video, but I'd love to skip on to a video from Brené Brown, who she is a psychologist and she speaks at TED Talks. Do you know TED Talks? It's kind of like church for secular people. That's how I think of TED Talks. People get up and they give sermons, if you like, on areas of their own research and boiling it down. And she speaks about how you can comfort people in all their own afflictions. And she makes a really helpful diagnosis of the difference between sympathy and empathy. She says, sympathy is looking down into the pit and saying, "They're there." Empathy is diving down into the pit, being alongside people and saying, "It's tough, isn't it? Me too." So let's have a look at her description of how to provide true comfort in the midst of suffering.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, "I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed." And then we look and we say, "Hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone." Sympathy is, "Ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich?" Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, "I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me." Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So 2 ways of handling people struggling in the dark. You could look down from on high and say, "At least, at least, at least," and silver line things. Or you climb down next to the person and you say, "Me too, me too." And that is true comfort. But as we think about the book of Job, Job knows a true friend. In chapter 16, he says to his miserable friends, he says, "I've heard many things like these. You are miserable comforters, all of you." Then at the end of the chapter, he says, though, "Even now my witness is in heaven, my advocate is on high, my intercessor is my friend, as my eyes pour out tears to God. On behalf of a man, he pleads with God as one pleads for a friend." There is a friend in heaven, and Job calls him a witness. He sees what's going on. An advocate, he speaks up for me. An intercessor, he prays for me, and he is my friend in the midst of suffering. And as we come through into the New Testament, we see this one, this friend who came in the flesh, Jesus Christ. And as he lived his life, he prayed the prayers of the Psalms. He prayed all those laments. The night before he died, he went into the Garden of Gethsemane, and he literally prays Psalm 88, that psalm that we began with. He says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Not just that he was worried about dying in the morning. He was saying his own sorrow felt like it could kill him. And there our friend in heaven takes on himself the despair and the darkness. He climbs down into the midst of the pit and he says, "Me too." The Christian God is not one who looks down from on high and says, "At least." He is the one who climbs down into the pit, comes alongside and says, "Me too, me too." And on the cross endures the darkness, the terror. On the cross he prays this psalm, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And he articulates the feeling of God forsakenness that all of us have. In suffering, so many of us ask the question, where is God? But before God answers that question, he asks that question. There is one, Jesus Christ, who comes in to our darkness and articulates that very same question with us and for us. We truly have a friend who has descended to the depths. And just finally, let's think about the future. Stephen Fry, it's interesting, on that first video when Stephen Fry was thinking about the future, he said, you have to have a sense of future. And then he said, even though you know that it's not going to work out. His sense of future ultimately, as an atheist, his sense of future ultimately is that the sun will explode and the universe will fling out into heat death and death wins and all that sort of stuff. And so the hope that the sun will come out tomorrow is only a very temporary truth. And yet I would suggest to you that within Christianity you have the most astonishing hope for a future. At the end of the book of Job, it says that the Lord restored Job's fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. All his brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him before came and ate with him in his house. They comforted and consoled him. It's a picture of the future where all things will be restored and redeemed. This is the Christian vision, that Jesus went through that cross, but he came out into a resurrection, and he promises to pull reality through that same path, through the darkness, not avoiding it, through the darkness, and out into the light. Which is why the Christian J.R.R. Tolkien put these words on the mouth of Samwise Gamgee. In the midst of the darkness, he says to Frodo, it's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, like the Bible, the ones that really mattered, full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out all the clearer. So those are the three things that I suggest to you we need. To acknowledge the fact of the feelings of depression, they are real. To know a friend in the midst of suffering, and to know a future beyond it.